Let's talk about this Alabama decision. And before we get to the politics, some say that the decision violates state and federal laws. It could be vulnerable to legal challenges. But at the same time, as surprised as we are, should we be? People have been concerned that the future of IVF has been at risk since Amy Coney Barrett joined the court.
Well, that's right. Before Amy Coney Barrett became a judge, she publicly supported a group that allowed that in vitro fertilization, IVF, could become criminalized. And here's how that works legally, Steph. Once the Dobbs decision is handed down and every state is free to set its own rules around abortion, states like Alabama adopted fetal personhood bills that said that life began at the moment of conception. Well, the embryos that are used in IVF are post-fertilization. They're post-conception. They're fertilized, they're permitted to grow for a few days, and then they're frozen for future use. So you can see how this works. In states that have fetal personhood, life begins at conception laws, then anything that's done to one of these embryos could possibly carry not just civil consequences, which is what's at stake in the case the Alabama Supreme Court just decided, but they could also carry criminal consequences. So that's the setup here.
Carol, this Supreme Court decision in Alabama, how risky is this for Republicans in an election year?
Look, here's this dynamic. The Republicans were already struggling with how to message on abortion. And now
they're going further.
And now they have this. And you've seen from various prominent Republicans, from Senator Tuberville of Alabama, who didn't really seem to understand what the ruling meant. And
he called it a bill.
Correct. And, you know, to Nikki Haley, to Tim Scott, who said he hasn't really studied the issue, and to former President Trump, who as of yet hasn't weighed in unless he has in the last few moments. And so this is a different dynamic for the polling reasons that you highlighted at the beginning of this, where even if those who are opposed abortion rights are for IVF treatments, it's how people get and grow their families. And then you see the Biden campaign, which is seizing all over this, from the White House to the campaign, and they intend to continue to do that. And the president and the vice president today just drawing this direct line, saying that this decision in Alabama is what they have been warning about after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, and they draw a direct line to former President Trump, saying it's his fault.
Peter, it is worth pointing out just how fringe this Alabama embryo decision is. Mike Pence of all people, we all know him as an outspoken opponent of abortion rights. He has talked in the past about how crucial IVF treatments were for his own family. He has said in the past that fertility treatments, quote, deserve the protection of the law. This is coming from Mike Pence. So what do Republicans say to their voters, many of whom approve of IVF? Many of those voters have families because of IVF.
Yeah, many Republican voters, if not most Republican voters, make a distinction between IVF and abortion. I mean, I think that they see the embryo created outside of the womb is different than an embryo created inside the womb as to whether or not that's a life that needs to be protected under the law. They see the creation of IVF, most Republicans as well as most Democrats, as the creation of life rather than the other way around, helping couples that aren't able to have babies in any other circumstance to have a baby, which is, of course, you know, the goal in some ways of the pro-life movement. So it is an extreme version of the logic of the pro-life movement that has, I think, upset and disturbed a lot of people who otherwise consider themselves to be pretty staunch pro-life advocates, to be, say, anti-abortion advocates. And I think that this is a place where the Republican Party is left to try to explain where it stands. And I don't think you've seen any kind of consensus there. The clips you showed show how unsettled this is for a lot of elected officials trying to straddle the line between the very strong fringe of their party and the mainstream of their party, which, even if it might be against abortion, isn't against IVF.
Joyce, what does this Alabama decision tell us about what else we could see from the courts after Dobbs? What could be next?
Right. I mean, what couldn't be next? Because there's always been a concern that birth control could be one of the next frontiers of attacks. It depends on how far conservatives are willing to push their agenda. And so to Peter's point, something very interesting is happening in Alabama today. There was a rush to put bills in play in both the Alabama House and the Alabama Senate that would roll this decision back. Bills that would say precisely the theory that Peter laid out, that it's not life unless it's inside of a uterus. So I think that we'll see this sort of practical political impact where Republicans know that Dobbs has been very damaging, not necessarily in the core of their electorate, but among others and certainly among women. And they won't want to go too far with this. I think that makes it unlikely that we'll see, for instance, a direct attack on birth control before the elections. But after that, maybe all bets are off.
But what do you make of this decision Republicans are making right now?
By the way, I just personally think Moses would have gone to Georgetown, Hoya Saxa. But yes, CPAC has always been kind of the Carney show of the single helix wing of the party. The problem we have is that wing now has a lot of power. We used to kind of ignore it and roll our eyes. So now it's kind of a trade show for, Right Wing Incorporated. But particularly in the House, Senate's a little different. It's kind of a runaway train. And that's a combination of folks who think like some of these, frankly, bozos you see at CPAC in ascendancy. Plus, it's such a narrow majority in the House that even if Speaker Johnson was any good at his job, and I don't believe he is, he'd have more to work with. So the Freedom Caucus, small in numbers but big in leverage, are able to drive the car even farther off the cliff. So I think we will have a shutdown. I think it'll be short. I don't know if it'll be that big of a thing by October, but it's Keystone Cop stuff, and it's not politically good for the party, obviously.
And it's also hugely expensive and a waste of time. Robert, what do you think about all this? I mean, let me just say it again. Totally. Sorry, I'm interrupting you. There is literally a January 6th themed pinball machine. Who do they think is going to play it? They're all in jail.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with Mike. I mean, I remember when CPAC was a faction of the Republican Party, and now it is the entire Republican Party. And I can, you watch these speeches, you see what's happening on Capitol Hill. This is a party now wholly owned by that faction and really marching farther and farther away from the mainstream. Farther away from that mainstream is exactly the trouble they got into in the 2022 election when they ceded what should have been a good election outcome for them to the crazies and the wackos that you see that are there now. So, look, I think you're resigned to a government shutdown. I think you're resigned to watching more and more of this sort of Keystone Cops happen. I'm reminded of when Chip Roy, who's a member of that Freedom Caucus, implored the House, which they control, by the way, as you pointed out, to give him anything to run on. Here we are closer and closer to Election Day. Republicans can't even run their own branch of government in the House that they control. And I think each day those sort of things give opportunities to the Biden White House and to the Biden campaign to leverage as part of this presidential election.
Mike, you talk about kind of the CPAC Carney show and sort of that right-wing faction. That is the Republican Party right now. That is the party of Trump. Donald Trump has a loyal and strong base, but there are not enough of them to win elections. Since he lost the last election, are you seeing him do anything, offer anything in terms of policy, his campaign, his rhetoric that would be attracting any other voters besides his base?
Let me just say, it's not the entire Republican Party. The problem is under Trump is the governing majority of the Republican Party. There's still a third, the 40% are out voting for Nikki Haley, who's not going to be the nominee. But those are not small numbers. There are Republican governors who roll their eyes at this. So one of Trump's problems is he has enough to muscle a primary and to have these henchmen run, particularly the House caucus. Whether or not that's enough to win a presidential election is still an open question. But no, Trump is not doing anything. Trump's theory is the country is going to fire Biden so he can run the world's biggest Republican primary till November and still win. And I have to say, because the president's numbers are so weak, it's not a crazy scenario. It can happen. The whole key to this election is, can Joe Biden repair himself enough to not get fired and open a vacuum for Trump. The country doesn't want Trump, but right now, at an equal level, they want to fire Joe Biden, and that is not where you want to be as president. No election tomorrow, it's February, but maybe Trump is giving, and the House Republicans are giving Biden tools with all this. I think Robert would argue that, but Trump can be unpopular all the way to getting elected here. Biden can't get his numbers up.
Robert, can Joe Biden repair himself from what, though? Do you need me to go through the laundry list of accomplishments he's had over the last 3 years? It's a long one.
Yeah, look, I think there are a few things he's got to do. He's certainly got to remind people of those accomplishments. They happen quickly. Signing ceremonies go. They've got to spend a lot of time reminding people of the important piece of legislation that they've put into effect and the impacts that they'll have on real people's lives, like cutting drug costs, increasing manufacturing jobs in this country. The president's economic health has to catch up with what we've seen in the improving consumer confidence numbers, which, to Mike's point, I'm glad there isn't an election tomorrow, but there is in 8 months. So that repair work has to happen. And then, as we talked about, I think he's got to use these openings and these maneuvers to put a choice in front of the American people about who do you want deciding these things over the next 4 years. That's a winning combination for Joe Biden.